Let's talk. Nice.
All right. Well, welcome to the Spencer Explores the Universe podcast. I'm today's guest host, Zach Jones. And normally when I'm on this show, Spencer and I are talking about movies from the 80s primarily. But with everything that's happening in the country right now and, with the coronavirus pandemic and now the movement for, against racial injustice, we figured it was time to have a more serious conversation about race because people seem to be very willing to listen to that right now. There is, it seems, all across the country and now seeing even across the world, the eyes are turned toward the U.S. and the conversation that this country needs to have about race. And obviously, I grew up in York, Maine, in a fairly privileged upbringing, but being with brown skin means that I still deal with the fallout in the legacy of racism dating all the way back to slavery in the United States. And it's an uncomfortable conversation that a lot of people don't like to talk about. So when this gets pushed to the forefront like this, there seems to be a lot of people that want to push it back. Normally, it seems to be there seems to be a lot of people that want to push it back into the background. But we're seeing something today that, in my experience, is much, much different. So I wanted to talk to my father, Archie Jones, and my great uncle Edgar about being black in America and the black experience, and basically how yesterday connects to today and how the things. There has obviously been improvements in race relations in the United States, but there are still a lot of things that are, as bad as they have been. And one of those things is black people being killed at the hands of the police. And this was obviously this whole thing was ignited by the murder of George Floyd, which. I have to say, when I first became aware of this and when I logged onto Facebook the day, there were just posts. Everybody was posting pictures and videos of George Floyd being murdered. And I just had to leave Facebook. I just thought, we're seeing this again. I can't believe it. I just didn't want to acknowledge that this was a real thing that was happening. Or not that I didn't want to acknowledge it, but I just didn't feel like having it in my face all day long when I think a lot of us have already been sort of overwhelmed and confused by what we're going through with the pandemic, and just seeing another black man being killed across the internet. I just felt like I just don't want to see this again, I guess. Not that I don't want to deal with it. We need to deal with it. But that was uncomfortable for me. I guess that whole, I thought that it would be a day of people sharing the video and sharing the memes, and then, cut to 4 days later and we'd be back to everybody telling jokes and talking about what they normally talk to. Because that seems to have been the trend over the last handful of years. The more we see videos on the internet of black men being killed, there will be a few days of everybody sharing Black Lives Matter memes, and then the next week it's like it didn't happen. But this time there was something different. It ignited this whole huge movement. So I wanted to, again, because we have, a great many people who are willing to listen to the problem of race in America, I wanted to have that discussion with two older black men who have lived as black men in the United States. So I guess, if you guys are comfortable sharing maybe some experiences from when you were young and kind of just, from being a child, learning how your skin tone maybe made you viewed differently. And then I'd like to get, into maybe talking about the civil rights movement of the 60s and maybe how that changed things or what that experience was like for you guys. And then also talk about how it compares to what we're seeing today. So I don't have any specific questions for you, but if either of you two would like to, share what you're comfortable sharing, maybe about, yeah, what it was like for you when you were younger, and maybe what you've seen change as through your lifetime. And feel free to if you have any questions for what my experience was like, or anything you want to know about each other, whatever you're comfortable sharing. Let's have the talk.
Okay, Edgar, I'll let you go first since you're the oldest.
Okay. I'm Duncan Edgar, I guess, and I was born in 1935. So I've seen pretty much the involvement of not only the civil rights movement, but even before then. Grew up in Jim Crow era and segregation and all the errors that have existed. And as Zach alluded to in his introduction pieces, this is the first time that I think that the movement has really impacted. I guess one of the things that have impressed me mostly is the total participation of all races. I think that is a tremendous impact on reaching some type of solution to whatever the things that we have been going through. Generally, I think, in general speaking, when you get good participation in whatever it might be, whether it's a movement or whether it's whatever it is, then there are always some type of results that come from it. So hopefully with the total participation of different races, different age groups, different with the political pieces and all of the things that's going on, maybe we will get some a real good solution out of what we're seeing. Starting with, let me start and back up a piece that some of the modern things that we are seeing basically have transformed or transpired over the time frame that I have been basically living. We have always had some form of segregation. We have always had some form of disagreement. We've always had some form of people standing up and making their voice heard, even when it was very devastating for it to be done. So I think that we have evolved or have been involved in different types of demonstrations and different levels. In the early time, the marches, as far as the segregation pieces and the integration pieces, particularly in the 60s and even in the 50s, was very few. We always had people that would stand up. I came out of a high school class of 1953, and out of that class, there was a certain mode of a group of them that became freedom riders. And what they did is interrupted their college education, and became freedom riders in order to go down and try to register people to vote. And none of my friends that was involved as freedom riders lost their lives, but they was very involved in a lot of frightening different episodes, as we have said over the years and discussed it. One of the things that we have an opportunity to do as schoolmates, we graduated from a segregated high school, and each Memorial Day since 1972, we have been able to go back to that high school and sit down and talk about different types of events that we have been involved in and the things that we have participated in. And out of that little high school, we have been able to really participate and be involved in a lot of different venues and all over the country. We fly in that weekend of Memorial Day from pretty much at least half of the states in the country. We and probably more. But what we do, we find out what is going on basically in the country area, and we discuss certain things and things that we was involved in. And as I've found over the years, we have learned that we have made some inroads. We have gotten some people in some key positions. We got some people that is congressmen. We had people that was generals. We had people that has really made some great impacts as far as things have gone forward. But what we also found out is that they are still certain things going on, such as there are certain positions that is not available for us, even though we have the education, we have the experience, we have those things, and that they have been in some ways not available to us because of the color of our skin. But we continue to fight, we continue to go forward, and we continue to persevere. So on that piece, I'll take a break and let Arch inject some things in, and then we'll come back and maybe you want to ask me some direct questions on some things that I maybe can give you some specific answers, and then also give you some things that I participated in as far as the civil rights movement was concerned, and give you some historical pieces and some things that is documented that you maybe can reflect and look at. Okay.
Afternoon, folks. My name is Archie, and I was born in 1949 in North Carolina, and I had my uncle for probably 2 years at home while I was growing up that I knew he was there. And I was a happy-go-lucky kid, not really understanding what my place in the world was at that particular point in time. And I think it came to a slamming halt when I was about 5 years old. And my grandfather and I, we were in this store in North Carolina, and I wanted to get some candied cigarettes. And he says, "No, you don't need any candy cigarettes." And there were 3 or 4 white men there. And they said, "Boy, buy that little boy some cigarettes." So they gave me a box of candy cigarettes. And I took one out and put it in my mouth. And one of the guys says, "It's not a cigarette until you light it up." And he struck a match and proceeded to light a candied sugar cigarette. And I spit it out, and it fell onto the floor. And I think to this date, that's one reason I don't smoke cigarettes, is because of that incident. And my grandfather really couldn't say anything because these were young, crazy kids. There were 3 of them, and they were 18, 19, 20, or whatever. And we were in a white general store, and I learned at that point in time, you don't stand out. So that was experience number 1. And then experience number 2 was with the kid that I always played with, I thought. He lived up the road from us, and come to find out, we were sharecroppers living on their land, which that sort of ate at me too. And I was playing with him, and he had to go home for something and wanted me to come along. And he ran in the front door, but I couldn't. I had to go around and go through the back door. And that stood out for me. I tell my kids that I have been working majority of my life to make ends meet. We harvested tobacco. We harvested corn. We did cotton in the fall. And since I think I started doing tobacco at age 5 so I could earn money for school supplies. And I had great grandparents. I had a great time with them. But as I got older, my grandfather kept telling me, these are things you can do and these are things you can't do. And the things that I couldn't do was question something that a white person had said to me. He says, you just don't do that. And that was hard for me to understand. And then in 1963, I think it was. No, I guess it was 62. Right when everything really started going down that we were hearing about as being black people, about what was going on, my grandfather says, they are demonstrating and they're marching, but you don't want to get involved because you will get hurt. My grandmother said, you only come in this world once and you got to go for the gusto. So my grandmother, I think she understood what was going on as far as my mind was concerned. My grandfather was more protective, trying to keep me from getting into trouble, because I was a real smart kid. I did really great in school, and I was always asking questions. And they saw me as someone that was going to be stepping out there, not keeping quiet. And my grandfather knew that I might get hurt. My grandmother said, you got to keep the fire in your heart. I was with them until 63, and they were both killed in an auto accident. And I moved to Washington, D.C. And this was I'd graduated from 8th grade. And I get to Washington, D.C., and the discussion is that kids coming up from the South, they're really dumb. They don't know anything, so they can't really go into the 9th grade with the regular kids because our school supposedly was inferior. But to that point, our school wound up being quite superior to the city schools because there are things that they were doing in the city schools in the 9th grade that I had learned how to do in the 3rd grade. So I started finding a voice for myself and started stepping out. Living in the city is totally different from living in the country. The country, you're a country bumpkin. You don't have to dress up and wear clothes when you're home because you're constantly doing vegetables in the gardening, or you're working in the fields, or doing a lot of other things. In the city, everybody wore gabardine pants, Stacey Adams shoes, all these things. Even though they didn't have the money to do that, they wore those clothes because that made them feel like they fitted in. I lived on 9th Street in Washington, D.C. That was considered the ghetto. I never considered myself as a ghetto kid. So when I had this gentleman help me to get in college, he was telling me that I lived in the ghetto. That was kind of hard to grasp that, because living with my grandparents, I would have sworn that I was middle class. The way we lived and the way we did things and the way we interacted, but that was middle class black, not middle class white. And there was a total distinct difference between those two things. I remember one of my cousins, he owned land and had a big farm. And even though he had all this stuff, he was still considered not equal with other people. He was just lucky that he was able to own that land. As far as getting involved in race relations, that type of thing, I always sort of had a chip on my shoulder, and my grandfather says, always make certain you count to at least 10 in your head before you respond when someone asks you something that you know is going to upset you. You have to learn to think with your head and not your fists. And that really came in handy when I went off to college. I went to college in Mount Pleasant, Iowa. Okay, here's a kid from North Carolina moving to Washington, D.C. for 4 years, living in the ghetto for 4 years, getting on an airplane and traveling to the Midwest to be set down in a town called Mount Pleasant, Iowa, there were 17 other black people on campus at that point in time. And learning to exist in that situation. Things were great on campus as far as professors are concerned, as far as black students are concerned. But there were white kids from all over the place. And they said they hated me. And I could not understand why somebody would hate me. And in having conversations with them, you find that the hate started with their parents, their grandparents, and trying to get through that whole process is really challenging. I've cried a lot, and then I stopped crying. I wanted to go home. Then I says, no, I'm going to stay. And I reached a point that said, if I'm going to make this work, I'm going to have to do it through the system. Whether they like me or not, I'm going to like them. I'm going to talk to them. And that's the thing that got me. It was always the talking. When you talk with people, you know, it's supposed to be humankind talking. So it's Archie, it's Mike, it's Tom, as to putting a third person there, them, and trying to get around that whole process. College was good because I learned the best way to get through the system is to be part of the system. And I got actively involved in a lot of things. And I'll stop now and let Zach ask some more pointed questions and go from there.
Well, first of all, thank you for sharing that. You brought up a couple things that I guess I'll before I mention those. So one of the things I'm seeing a lot when I go on social media and read, comments from people who are obviously trying to understand what this movement is all about, and also other people who just want it to go away, or they want to shift the focus over to rioting and looting instead of the greater problem. I think one of the major things I'm seeing, or one of the major misunderstandings, I guess, that I'm seeing on both sides of the argument, and I guess particularly I'm talking about, my white friends, is that, so you mentioned the difference between middle class white and middle class black, and you also mentioned, hate that had been passed through generations. And I think one of the biggest things that a lot of people who are trying to be on the right side of the argument, or the other people that are just trying to shove it away or divert attention, one of the biggest things that gets missed is that there is this sort of fabric that weaves all of that stuff together that is always there. I see a lot of comments from people that were like, well, I didn't own slaves. I've never called anybody the N-word. Why am I part of the problem? And I've also seen them say, like, you were never a slave. You've never, I had a hard time too. I think they have a hard time connecting the legacy of slavery and how that turned into sort of, the criminalization of the black male, or the sort of inferior image of the black race, and how that has lasted through slavery to current days, and basically like how that affects economically, where one family can be middle class black, but that's considered the ghetto by other standards, part of that too, just with that sorry, I'm having a hard time focusing my thoughts here. There's a lot going through my head. But I guess, because of this movement being sparked by George Floyd's murder, obviously there's a lot of attention being placed on police departments and how they conduct their business. But at the same time, behind that is this whole, socioeconomic system that they are just part of that bigger system. And obviously we see something as horrible as a man getting killed on camera, but behind that is a whole system that's stopping black people from achieving more. We, even before George Floyd was killed, we were seeing how coronavirus was disproportionately affecting black families, and that's because a lot of them live, because of the socioeconomic, positions, end up living in closer quarters in poor neighborhoods with less access to healthcare. They work jobs that are still considered essential through the coronavirus, but don't have proper protections and stuff like that. So and also just the stress of everyday racism. That they say heart problems and stuff like that are more common in because of stress and stuff like that in the black community. And so we were seeing, a disproportionate amount of deaths just from coronavirus, and that is, was starting to get a little bit of media attention. But obviously, when we saw essentially a public lynching, that is what ignited the fire. But I think what people need to understand is, below the surface, there is a more deeply rooted problem that needs to be addressed. And, I think that, that reflects in what you said about, they learned their hate from their parents, who learned it from their parents. And I guess, sorry, this is more of a ramble than a question.
I think that, as Archie related, we grew up with a very strong mother figure that was always projecting that we was as good as anyone else. That was one of the things that she always said. And her push was that for us to get a good education. And then in her mind, we could compete We can compete with anyone, anybody, or anything. One of the things that we were awarded with was a good education. That was one of the things that we wasn't ever held back as far as working that farm or being kept out of school. Now, the process as a sharecropper, and let me explain a little of that, and then I'll get into the middle class pieces. If you was raised in the country as a sharecropper, the basic pattern was that you went to school the first day of school, and it was rare that you got to go back to school until maybe around Thanksgiving or maybe after Thanksgiving. That means that all the crops was harvested and everything was in, and then you could go back and begin your education. Now you can imagine missing a third of your school year and how far you would be behind. Well, we was fortunate enough to have parents to know that wasn't very acceptable. So they made sure that we went to school. We got a very good education, and that was stressed. What I found, even with the education and being able to compete, that once you get into a certain position, and I worked basically all my life in working in the labs in some form as a chemist and working in the chemical field. Even with me being a compounder and I worked in a rubber industry, making heels and soles and that type. I wrote compounds for those. That was one of my first chemical job. I worked in that for about 12 years. And then I left there because of there were some very crucial needs in the last part of the 60s that was culminated with the civil rights movement, that the police force, and I went to work for the police department as a forensic chemist to work with them. It was very insensitive that they had police officers that was working in doing lab work and crime scene investigations that wasn't qualified to do those type of analysis that was required for the criminal justice system to accept, and having the credentials to do so. So the commissioner of the police commissioner decided to remove the police officers and put them out on the street where they were needed, and bring civilian people in that was qualified to do the analysis that the system demanded. Now the education piece come to bear. Not only did we have that I met the criteria for the education and the experience, but I was required to take a civil service exam also. In my civil service exam, I made 97.5 on my civil service exam as a forensic chemist. And when I went to be interviewed by the manager per se of the lab, the question was asked to me, how did I score so high on the exam that I must have cheated? And to me, that was a real racist approach to my education and my piece, as far as what I felt like I was involved in. But that was a piece of the racism and my first taste of some of the things that took place in the police department. There were several racial things that went down over my 25 years of working with them and watching and looking and seeing. There are things that happened firsthand in crime scenes that I saw. One of the things that really stood out with me, I was a very outspoken person. I got into some real situations by being so, but it didn't deter it in any way. One of the districts in Baltimore was the Western District. That's the heart of the black community. 99 or 95% of that community is black. And I was working as a supervisor, working an evening shift. We had a homicide on one of the major streets in the center of Baltimore City. I rose up on the scene that we got 2 crime lab units there, and both of those units is occupied by white technicians. There were 7 police cars there, and every one of those cars was occupied by a white police officer. Now, you say, well, why is that important? The thing that I believe that happens to help the situation that is going on today is diversity. I think we gotta take people that looks like me and live like I am to be involved in the community. They know the community, they understand the community, and they can relate to the community. That's one of the pieces that I think will help fix some of the things that's going on today. And so I couldn't understand basically why it was 9 police cars at that location, and I was the only black person that was there. And so that was a pattern, a picture pattern that today you can see the same pieces. If you look at George Floyd today, 15 days ago, and look at what occurred to him, you look at the personnel that was involved in that particular situation and tell me how much diversity there was there. So I think that's a piece that we are experiencing in great detail today.
Yeah, my one of my brothers was really concerned that he was thinking that that his voice hasn't been loud enough in speaking through this movement, and I was trying to explain to him that just by being who you are in a mostly white community, you're making a difference every single day. And I think, and I'm not sure if I totally got through to him, but I just think about, having grown up in a mostly white community, I got to, benefit from my dad being a huge part of the community. And just, Dad, you being who you are and being an influential member of the community made my life easier. I think people, as soon as they were like, "Oh, you're Archie's son," all of a sudden it was like, it was a pass, or at least, a little bit of the judgment faded away because he had already done that work just by being there and just by representing. And so, yeah, I can see how that's absolutely true. Yeah, when you've got 8 or 9 white police officers on a scene. Having that representation. I guess I also benefited from. It's weird being a child in the '80s. There was a lot of really popular black culture stuff, like the Cosby Show is incredibly popular, and then we had the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, and like Family Matters. Like there was like family sitcoms. They were just about normal black families doing normal things, and they were popular TV shows. And like that seems kind of trivial. But at the same time, I think that just having those shows on television made an impact in the quality of my childhood because all of my friends and their white families would go home and watch Dr. Huxtable and his, attorney wife, or, watch, Family Matters with their families. Their father's a police officer. And I almost feel like, maybe I'm just more out of touch with modern pop culture, but I almost feel like there was more of that then than there is now. But I think that positively impacted my experience, just having black people on television as normal people and not, not shown as criminals or as they normally are or had been up to that point.
Yeah, it's sort of crazy that people look at you and you put a white man and a black man together and walk them through the city. You will have the cops following the black guy, and the white man nothing at all. And I came to Maine as a pharmacist. The word pharmacist was great. And then people came in and they saw me. Oh, you're the technician. No, I'm the pharmacist. And it took about 3 years to get it across that for the people to start accepting me in the neighborhood, because I cared about their health. And then they realized I cared about their health. And then they started caring about me. And that's the crazy thing, is you can go, long as you're in your own neighborhood, as a black man, you're great. You go out of that neighborhood and you become a suspicion. And that's what always sort of turned me upside down. Like, why is it okay to be Archie in Kittery, York, or wherever, and people accept me for who I am, and they know Archie, and I go, say, down to Massachusetts, and I walk around and people look at me as a suspect, not as another person that's shopping. If it was a white man walking through the neighborhood, nobody would pay any attention to him because he's shopping. I'm dressed nice, I'm shopping, but I go into a store and people start to look over like I'm going to steal something from them. And that's part of the culture that buried in brain, that alarms go off when they see a black man. And it was really funny, sad. And when I was in Iowa and going to school, it almost became sort of a joke. You walking down the street on 236 236, that goes through Mount Pleasant, Iowa, and you have big semis traveling down that road, and the road goes right through the campus. And so here you are, a black student. You got to walk down to the laundromat, which is in town, and you're walking with your clothes on the back of your shoulder. You cross railroad tracks and you're into city proper, basically. And here comes some people walking down the street to meet you. They're meeting you. And they actually step off the road, get into the street to battle a semi versus walking past me to say hi. And I always said hi to them and shocked the daylights out of them. But that, I'm like, do I have antlers or something different on my head that's causing them to feel this way, or what is it? And it's just part of the civilization, I guess.
That I showed you this documentary 13th the other night, which I found incredibly eye-opening. It's I don't know if you've seen it, Edgar or Spence, but there's it's called 13th. It's on Netflix. It's a filmmaker named Ava DuVernay, who I think is absolutely great, especially her commentary on race. But in the movie 13th, she talks about how the 13th Amendment freed the slaves, and obviously we all know about the Civil War and how much of an impact slavery had on the economy of the South, and why they obviously didn't want to give that up. But in the 13th Amendment, there is basically a loophole that says, free unless convicted of a crime. And that basically they're like, immediately after the 13th Amendment was passed, that aspect of the 13th Amendment or that loophole was taken advantage of. So prior to, slaves being freed, you had the slave catchers and stuff like that. But now all of a sudden it was like, we need to catch you doing criminal stuff, because as soon as that happens, we can put you on a chain gang. We can put you, on some sort of prison production line instead. Or, we can still have you harvesting crops, but now you're doing it as a prisoner instead of as a slave. And how that has basically followed us through the modern day. And and you saw it and she talks about it in the documentary, the earliest forms of pop culture. Birth of a Nation was one of the first like popular movies, and it was also one of the first movies to portray black men as criminals and racists and sort of glorify the Ku Klux Klan. But then still right up through, I mean, you know, I was talking about those TV shows in the 80s, but if you look at movies in the 80s still, most black men were shown as criminals. So, you know, I think one of the movies that Spencer and I talked about recently, it's, you know, is one of my favorite movies is the National Lampoon's Vacation. But the one scene where there's black people in it is they take a wrong turn in East St. Louis and they get robbed. You know, and it's like that sort of thing in the media. If you grew up somewhere where you were never exposed to black people before, and that was all you saw was, you know, seeing crime reports and seeing media with black people portrayed as criminals, you know, but how else are you going to think except for, oh, here comes a black guy. I'm going to take my chances with this truck that's coming at me rather than share the sidewalk with him. So, and I can also just relate to, you know, I find myself, you know, I like to dress up a lot, and I find myself, you know, rather than being followed through the store, looked at suspiciously, most people assume that I work wherever I am. You know, I've played shows where I wear a suit on stage, and after I get off stage, I'm standing over by the merch table in the lobby, and somebody will come and ask me for directions to the bathroom. You know, like that's what it's like. I don't work here. I just played a show. That it just doesn't go away. It's like you're either an employee or you're trouble.
Well, one of the modern pieces I think we look at is as you talked about the virus that we're going through and some of the things that the economic pieces that we are exposed to, the living conditions, we have to come up with some way of education as far as fair schooling, funding, those type things. Not particular being in a large city, in an urban setting. The inner city schools are not funded at the degree that county schools and the upper crust schools are funded. So naturally, that plays a tremendous part as far as the type of education and the opportunities that is afforded us, you know, that we can come in contact with. And that's one of the basic pieces that's got to be addressed. We got to address it at a lower level of understanding, lower level of contact. Our youth has got to get to a point that they can obtain the type of education, as Arch related when he came to D.C. about the idea that he was like the skills and the knowledge to compete. So, but the real piece of it now is that if you go to an inner city school, that you can't compete. You know, it was obvious in 70. One of the things that we was exposed to, I was exposed to, as going into a new type of work environment, is that we went in and there was a small handful of black guys that also went in with a larger group of white guys that came out of predominantly white colleges. And what we found is that as years went on, 5-7 years, is that the percentage stayed where it was. The percentage didn't change, and it didn't really start to change until we got into management and really started making some effort to change it. So what we did, we started going out to the black colleges, doing a recruiting process, exposing black kids that was graduating from college, that had science as a background, that could get into forensics and make a career out of it. And that was something that they wasn't even aware of, or the school wasn't even aware of, or projected it. And so we were able to make tremendous inroads in doing that simply by going and recruiting, I guess, talking to kids about would they be interested in coming in and being some type of forensic chemist. I just think that we have to get, and so the great deal of that, even with, your income increases, you can do better things for your family. You can expose them to better living conditions. And in that way, we can be more able to compete. Now, have said all of that, they still got to be a lot of things done as far as the inner cities are concerned, because we will always have the poor. We will always have people at disadvantages. So the table has got to be flattened in some way, so that even they can compete. And if they are given a good shot, a fair understanding from the beginning, I think the approach as far as skills is concerned will be better. It's got to be one of the things that must happen. Whenever you take a school building, take the school building and stop it from being an education facility and convert it into a training center for police officers to lock up people, or a prison system to lock up people, or a detention center for locking up people. There's something wrong with that particular approach, and I've seen some of that take place. So we got to do a lot of things as far as to get a level playing field for us to be able to kind of improve our living situation.
What do you guys think on a structural level? What do you guys think would make the most impact? And I guess the reason I ask that is obviously we're seeing, I guess anytime there is civil unrest like we're seeing now, there usually is some sort of, something comes of it. There's some sort of reactionary attempt to address the problem, but it never seems to be permanent, or it never seems to be, and I guess, or there seems to be a reaction to it that sort of undermines whatever was achieved. And I guess, for example, after the Civil Rights Act, it was like, okay, we've got the right to vote now, but now we're ramping up the war on drugs and things that will imprison more black people and disenfranchise their right to vote that they just won. I guess after Ferguson, the Obama administration said that they would stop selling, military gear to police departments. And of course, that administration goes away, the new one comes in, and we're right back to selling military gear to police departments. So, and I guess things like that. Like in the past few days, we've seen some concessions from, New York and Los Angeles and Minneapolis have all said that they're gonna look at their funding or look at their root problems. And obviously those are victories, but to what extent are they going to be lasting victories? And Los Angeles said that they are looking at defunding the Los Angeles PD by, I think, $1.5 million, something like that. And they would be reinvesting that money into poor communities. And I think that's fantastic. But then I looked at what the annual budget for the Los Angeles Police Department is, and it's $1.6 billion a year. And, is this $1.5 million defunding going to be forever? Or is this just hey, we're going to do this now, and when you're not paying attention, we're going to get back? Like, I know this is a loaded question, but I guess I'm just asking either of you, with what you've seen in your lives, what do you think we need to do at a systematic level to make this change permanent and not just reactionary to whatever tragedy of the day is?
The impact, as I look, it's a total unit. The criminal justice system need not just the police department, themselves, the criminal justice system need to be revamped. Whenever a criminal goes to trial, the state's attorney, the judge, the whatever court level it is, the tendency for the judge itself is to believe whatever the police officer have written in a report, whether it's true, whether it's truthful, whether it's not. So some way, some balances has to be done, because I have read police reports that I have been involved in, and it looked like a total different piece. You know, that these things definitely didn't happen according to what his report states, and what happened was a total different story than what he has written. But the judge believed him because he a police officer. So somewhere in the structure of the revamping or the tearing down of the police department, it's got to be some truthfulness guidelines in. How do you build that? I don't know. I really don't have that. As they say, that's above my pay grade, and I don't know how you really would do that with the exception of having honesty, and that comes from leadership, pretty much from the head of whatever department that you're overseeing. So I guess my answer is that the complete criminal justice system, from judgeship right on down to the police officers themselves.
Something I had never heard of before a couple days ago is qualified immunity, which I just brought up the definitions because I didn't want to try to recite it off the top of my head, but it says a legal doctrine in the United States federal law that shields government officials from being held personally liable for discretionary actions performed within their capacity unless their actions violated, in quotes, clearly established federal law or constitutional rights. And of course, this whole article gets into, apparently it was first sort of became a concept in the 60s, but somewhere in the 80s really became applied to police misconduct a lot. And apparently this qualified immunity is why even police officers that are charged for crimes often are not convicted. It's because the clearly established aspect of the violations of federal law. And that scares me looking at, we've seen the 4 officers involved with George Floyd's death. They've all been arrested and charged now, but is there any clearly established federal law for federal agencies for government officials, that would hold somebody accountable for kneeling on somebody's neck? There's no, to my knowledge, probably no legal precedent in a court case that specifically addresses that. And that, I'm getting ahead of myself here, but it frightens me to think that these officers may not be convicted for this crime, even though we all witnessed it. And that has been, something that's been recurring since, I guess it's only been 12 or 15 years that everybody's had a camera in their pocket to capture these events, which is why we're seeing them more and more. It's like they were always there. We just never saw them. But only in the past, only since we've been seeing them, really have officers even been charged at all for this. But I think I looked at a stat the other night, and I should have printed it out or had it in front of me as well. But I think it was something about, and this is where I wish I had somebody right next to me fact checking, but it's something about in the past like 5 or 6 years of like 20 officers that have been charged. I think only like 3 of them have been convicted. And those are not encouraging numbers.
Well, the crazy thing is that everything is based on fear, and that's what we're seeing. The government tell the people, you got to be afraid of this group of people. This group of people do X to you. So are they going to take your job? Are they going to take your house or whatever? And so everybody's afraid of everybody else. And we got to get to the point that we can sit down, have discussions. And I'm Archie. I'm Josh. I'm Tom. I'm whatever. And we have a relationship. when you get that relationship, you lose the fear of that somebody's trying to run something over on you. And that's where America is right now, is that they are afraid, my generation, that somebody's going to take something away from them, which there's nothing really to take away from them. They still own it, but they don't believe that they do.
We have, so when you look at the videos from the 60s and the marches and stuff, you see a lot of black faces in the protests. But when you turn on the TV today, you see mixed race all over the place. You know, you see white faces, brown faces, black faces, everybody standing up for the same cause. So I guess my question is, what can we tell our white allies who are trying to understand this issue and trying to be on the right side and trying to be more aware? In the past week, I've had a lot of friends reach out to me and, either, just trying to understand what they can do to help, or if they ever said something that was offensive, or, so what message do you think that we can tell our white allies who are trying to help us achieve the equality that we're looking for?
Have a conversation. Having a conversation with someone gives you the chance to meet that person, know that person, understand that person. Just because my skin is black doesn't mean I'm going to hurt you. Just stick your hand out and say, hi, my name is such and such. And that's what I've always taught my kids. You go into a situation, you stick your hand out, you introduce yourself. That starts conversation. And that gets the ball rolling.
I agree 100% with that. But we have to be willing on both sides of the aisle situation, race, to ask questions. And maybe it have been fear, but hopefully by seeing the diversity that's taken place in this particular demonstration, is that they see that we can get along, we can have the same aspirations, the same goals, and hopefully it will generate that conversation that is needed. And we need it at all levels. This is one of the things. It's not just a political level that we need this. We needed it. We need it with neighbors. We need it with people that we don't know. We need it in churches, and we need it. And one of the things that I really haven't seen the churches come out in any great magnitude and address this in any way, particularly evangelicals. And I may not, maybe I haven't noticed it, but I haven't seen that. So we need to do that. We need to really open up our churches and receive someone that don't look like we are, like we look, and be able to really receive them. You know, they said that in years past that the most segregated hour that was in the country was at 11 o'clock on a Sunday morning. So we need to be able to feel comfortable in going into other churches and not being, looked at and ostracized in any way. So I think that's one of the things that we need to do.
I think maybe what I would add is I see a lot of people just individualizing and not quite understanding their role in the greater society. And so maybe it's just, maybe you've never called anybody the N-word or never even thought about it, but you could be benefiting from somebody who did. And just kind of understanding, it's not about you. It's about all of us is, I guess, the biggest thing. I see a lot of people trying to on an individual level, try to figure out their part, which obviously everybody plays their part, but I think we're all part of this society and all part of our communities. So just kind of understanding your role in the bigger picture.
Just like your parents say, play nice in the playground, in the sand pit.
And I was fortunate to have some wonderful parents. Thank you, Dad.
You're welcome.
So I want to thank both of you for having this conversation and being here. And I want to thank Spencer for letting me take over his podcast for an episode. And yeah, thank you so much. I love all of you.
I love you too.
So long, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
It's time for Happy Hour, presented by Maine Spirits. We keep the train rolling. We keep showing you how to make the drinks at home. Because why feel like you have to go out? It's nice to go out. It's nice to go out and have a drink. It's nice to go out to a nice bar and have a nice drink. Nothing will replace that experience, but what we can replace is you drinking like crap at home. So we can fix that. So that's what we're doing here at Happy Hour. Today, we are going to learn how to make a classic cocktail that's got some very, very fundamental ingredients. We're doing a kind of a twist on that, and we're going to show you how to make a sidecar. Now, we are going to make ours with brandy. Why? Because we had some brandy, some nice brandy for cooking, and it's actually quite nice and tastes great. So let's learn how to use that in a take on a sidecar. So for tools, we'll need a shaker, a strainer, a jigger, and a small plate. For ingredients, we will need, instead of cognac, we're going to use a nice brandy. We're going to use Cointreau, lemon juice, and superfine sugar. Let's build this thing. If you don't have superfine sugar, because who does, you can make your own by adding regular sugar to a food processor or a mortar and pestle and grinding it into a fine powder. So, spread the superfine sugar on a small plate, kind of like if you were going to rim a margarita glass with salt. Rub lemon wedge halfway around the rim of your glass. Dip the rim in sugar. Set that aside. In your shaker, add 2 ounces of brandy, 1 ounce of Cointreau, and a half ounce of fresh lemon juice. Now add ice and shake until you look like an idiot. Until very cold. Then strain into your prepared glass. You could either use a martini glass or a coupe glass for this drink. So now, let's take a sip. The Brandy Sidecar. Another simple, classic cocktail, or a slight variation on a classic cocktail, brought to you by Happy Hour. Brought to you by Maine Spirits. Maine Spirits can be found online at mainspirits.com, or you can download their app for your smartphone and search all kinds of recipes from this guy to many other people who know much more about what they're doing than I do. Additionally, you can follow them on Instagram at main_spirits. Thank you for joining us, and as always, we encourage you to drink deliciously and responsibly. Spencer Explores the Universe is brought to you by Maine Spirits. You can visit them online at mainspirits.com or download their app or visit them on Instagram at main_spirits. The show is also brought to you by Bull Moose, serving Maine and New Hampshire's music, movie, video game, and book and trinket needs since 1782. Also brought to you by Sun Tiki Studios at 375 Forest Avenue or at suntikistudios.com. Spencer Explores the Universe is a Mistakes Were Made production.